Hi everyone, I can't believe we are here in week 8. This is your PH 507 course review. I also have a lot of important information in this last PowerPoint and voiceover, so be sure to watch all of this presentation. Okay, so for this video and PowerPoint presentation, just starting off with announcements. I know several have asked for extensions. The thesis capstone proposal portfolio was due Wednesday, and I would encourage you that if you are still able to turn it in Wednesday or earlier, the sooner the better. But if you need extra time, especially after you propose and maybe you want to make adjustments, I'm okay with extending it until Saturday night. That way you just have a little bit more time if you need it. And again, you can always submit earlier. There will be one example of a portfolio template that's also in the week 8 folder, and I will put it under portfolio guide. So be sure to check that just to double check that you have your portfolio in the right order and things like that. So I don't have an example since you are the first cohort who is doing this portfolio style, but I at least put together some pages so you can have more or less a portfolio template. And then also, I know this is a tough class. It's almost like teaching 2 classes because we are writing your proposal paper and portfolio at the same time, doing regular research methods. And so I know it's a tough class and we have our final exam. So again, a few requested an extension, so I'm going to do it for everybody, and I'm going to extend the final exam to Tuesday night. So you'll have until week 9 Tuesday night, October 22nd, but I will open up the exam this coming Thursday, October 17th. So again, if you want to take it earlier and be done with the course, then please do. It's good to get stuff done early, but if you need just that little bit more time after doing the proposal portfolio and you want a little bit more time studying, giving you the weekend and also Monday and Tuesday to do that if you need it. The next 2 points in the agenda is the final exam details. So this goes over, what's in the exam and how best to study and approach it. And then I'll go over a little bit of a course review, including some data analysis review. Number 2 and 3 were previously recorded, just FYI in case I make some reference that you're not aware of, but the information in those recordings are still the same and would apply for this course. But of course there's new information for the portfolio. So number 4, we'll go over the proposal portfolio paper details and all the sections that you need. And then I'll wrap up with a final checklist. What do you need to wrap up PH 507? And a little bit of a checklist for beyond once you're done with this course. So hopefully all this information will be really helpful for you.
All right, so for the final exam, it is cumulative. There are 4 to 5 scenarios and 45 questions. Actually, let me take that back. It's 45 points. So there may be questions that maybe have 3 points attached to it if there's some type of matching or something like that, but it's 4 to 5 scenarios and 45 points. Might be 45 questions, it might be less if some of the questions have more than 1 point attached to it. But anyhow, I had a few ask me whether the exam was cumulative or not. It's definitely cumulative because what we're doing in this class is applying research. So the only way that I'd be able to test you in the last few weeks would just be kind of knowledge base, and that's not the style or the way that I want you to learn. It is in the syllabus, as you can see here. That part has never changed. So always kind of refer back to the syllabus if you have any questions about the course. So again, it was in the syllabus that it is cumulative. And again, because it's scenario based, you do need knowledge on evaluation designs. You do need knowledge on things that can, and sampling that can help you then. One of the additions to the final exam is the statistics and choosing the right 1. So it's cumulative, but in a way that is beneficial, and I think will help understand the full picture of research methods. The best way to prepare for the final exam is definitely read the chapters, and I give you some pointers at the end on which ones to focus on. Review all of the PowerPoint slides in Cougar courses and your class notes. So if it's something that I've mentioned in class or that we've talked about or practice scenarios. And when I mean all PowerPoint slides, it's all the textbook slides and also any additional that I've posted up. And if I've posted additional supplemental slides, it's usually because that's the type of content that it's the way that I want you to learn perhaps that content. So definitely pay attention to the slides that I've either aggregated or added up as posted as supplemental. Another way to study is to make up scenarios. I would take a few concepts and think, which is exactly how I create the exam. Like, okay, I kind of want one question to be focused on quasi-experimental design, and one question, want it to be focused on an experimental design. So how can I develop a scenario around that, just to make sure we're getting a good spread of all the content? So try to come up with some concepts and think about what scenarios might apply. You can study alone, go through the concepts. And another tip is to study in groups. So maybe you all come up with, or each person comes up with different scenarios, and you can kind of work through what type of design it is, what's the sampling, what data analysis, would you choose based on the type of variables that you're looking at. So it's good to study both alone and also in groups if you have a chance. So which chapters to read? I've listed them here. It's basically 1 through 14, 16, 17. So basically everything except for 15 and 18. For chapters 8 and 16, I would say focus less on those and just kind of glance through. I believe they're the qualitative ones that I've provided some supplemental slides on. So definitely focus 1 to 14, 16 and 17, with perhaps less focus on 8 and 16. So those are the chapters to make sure you read. Okay, I'm going to go over some of the concepts for the exam in 3 parts or 3 chunks. And really, I'm not necessarily going to lecture on all of these concepts again, but I did want to use this course overview or review to just kind of point you in the right direction for the exam. So there will be times where I slow down if maybe they were slides that were posted, but maybe we didn't elaborate so much in class. But for the most part, I'm going to be going through these slides pretty quickly. Luckily, since this is recorded, you will be able to pause and rewind or listen to it again. But anyhow, so for this first part, I want to make sure that you understand the 9-step process of research and its rigor. Know different types of data and research, the qualitative, quantitative, the difference between research and practice, always the Belmont Report principles, exploratory versus conclusive. We had chapter 4 was on observational research. We've talked a lot about internal threats to validity, and also the difference between experimental, quasi-experimental, and non-experimental designs. So here are a few slides, again, just to point you in the right direction. Won't necessarily go through them in detail. So here's the 9-step process. Try to, I guess memorize the 9 steps and what the order is, but kind of the important part is that step 1 is to identify a priority population, and step 2 is to formulate your research question. for a single goal. So sometimes those get flipped and people might think you have a question and then you look for your population. But using this particular 9-step process is actually identifying your priority population first, and then going through the steps sequentially. And we also know that from this slide that after you've answered your research question and even disseminated your results, that goes back into a loop of, kind of asking more questions. What more can you do? So the research process is not start to end, it's actually more circular. So you're done with one question, but usually it incites other questions that need to be answered. Make sure you know your research designs. There are a couple broad categories, even just illustrated here. So you have observational research on the one side, and then on the right side you have experimental research. In the observational research side, it goes from qualitative to cross-sectional to cohort study or panel designs. Now another category or categorical difference here is the difference between qualitative research, which has more to do with words and themes and codes, focus groups, interviews, etc., as compared to quantitative research, which is all about numbers. And so you have words for qualitative, numbers for quantitative research. So once you start getting into the experimental designs, you have your true experimental studies, usually RCTs, so randomized control trials. But also there are times when you cannot randomize and you do have to use a quasi-experimental study design. So this is when you have a comparison group. And again, the main difference is that you're not able to randomize people into different groups. Here are the common threats. I think we've used a lot of these in examples that we've talked about in class. I'm going to go through these really quickly because you can either rewind or you can, I would just actually go through these on your own and try to think of scenarios. But if you remember, the Hawthorne effect is a difference that participants might feel just because they are getting perhaps more time and attention. So it might not have anything to do with your actual intervention or that you're trying to change behavior, but perhaps just being around staff or being a part of a program itself makes a difference or changes behavior. Diffusion, usually we say diffusion of innovation, has to do with contamination. So again, if you're working in a school and you want to do an intervention control, it's probably not a good idea to do it within the same school because students are going to talk, and therefore your intervention is going to be contaminated, and you might not see the results that you want. History has to do with event that occurred. So if you're doing an intervention on smoking and all of a sudden there's a new campaign on smoking, kind of and messes with your understanding of whether it was your actual intervention that made a difference or perhaps this event or something in history that had an effect on participants. Maturation, we tend to talk about the best example is kids. So if you're weighing them from one year to the next, you want to take into account that they are growing. So it's not that year 1 and year 2, well, they've gained some weight and that's your result. They gain weight or they grow naturally. So it could be, as it says here, whether older, wiser, stronger, or more experienced. That all has to do with maturation, and those are things you need to take into account. Testing. So if you're constantly giving someone the same test, they're eventually going to learn what perhaps the right answers are or what you're looking for. And so now you have apparently perhaps some responses that look like the behavior was either changed or they have more knowledge of something, but really it was because they've been receiving the test multiple times. Instrumentation, that has to do with a change in the actual instrument. I think that the example we used in class was a weight scale. So let's say we took, a couple of people's weights, and then somehow the instrument or the scale itself was not calibrated, or somehow it got off a little bit. And it made the next few participants or group look like they either had gained or lost weight. But the fact is that it was an issue of instrumentation. There was something wrong with the scale itself. The physical scale. Don't want to get that mixed up with other concepts here. So a physical scale to weigh. So the measuring instrument itself had some type of change. Another way actually that we talk about instrumentation too, and why we don't try to change surveys after you've started giving it out, is oftentimes you'll give out a survey, you'll start to see that, people aren't really understanding question 2 and question 5. So you go back and you actually change it, improve it, and now people are understanding it. Well, that is actually a really good example of a change in the instrument. So the first people who got the survey, had question, 2 and 5 worded very differently, and then you improved it. The results, you might interpret something from those results, but essentially it's really about instrumentation. So that's why once you give a survey or once you do something with a participant, you don't want to make any changes because of instrumentation. Statistical regression, often called statistical regression to the mean. I think the example we used here in class was, let's say you were giving a happiness test to a set of employees, but it was during their an employee banquet or party. Everyone might be extremely happy. And they might score really high, but if you were to ask them any other time, their true scores, might be more revealed, or if you did ask them a second time after the party, they regress back to the mean. So their scores would regress back to what it normally would be. It just happened to be extreme scores or extreme happiness for some reason, but that's the idea of statistical regression. Is regressing back to what would it normally had been, or regressing back to the mean. Differential selection. So here, and oftentimes this has to do with perhaps volunteering and motivation. The results might be due to differences in how people were selected into the study before it began, or into the different types of treatment. So again, volunteering, you're like, oh, I'll volunteer to be a part of, this intervention or physical activity group. And then those who don't volunteer are part of the control or comparison. Well, they've selected differently, so inherently there's differences. And the same is true for the last part, differential attrition. So perhaps there's some characteristic from group 1 to group 2, that whether it's has to do with age or ability, knowledge, there's something about a group that's in one group versus the other that's making them drop out. So that's differential attrition versus differential selection. The next one is our fun evaluation designs. We've gone over this a lot, but just remember the way, if you know the symbols and you know what they mean, then you'll know that if there is an R, it's 2 groups randomized, it's one type of experimental design. And to figure out the exact type, look at your observations and when they occur. If it's like the first one, pre-test, post-test, before and after X, which is your intervention, before and after, then it's pre-test, post-test. Like in example 2, if it's the observations are just after your intervention, it's post-test only. If you have multiple observations, it's time series. And then if you take away those R's, but you still have 2 groups, that's your quasi-experimental design. So again, you have 2 groups, but they're not randomized. And not every single design is here. So you might have a post-test only quasi-experimental design. But again, just by knowing the characteristics, you should be able to name the particular design. And then, as you know, if you have no comparison or no control group, it is non-experimental. And again, the type has to do with where the observations are placed, whether before and after the intervention. So just make sure you remember how to read these through and the different types of characteristics. Okay, so the second part that I'm going to go over, a little bit of sampling. Make sure you really truly understand different types of data. So whether it's nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio, you want to make sure that you understand whether something is categorical or whether it's numerical. So that really makes a difference in how you decide what type of statistical analysis to use. So it's very simple, but sometimes it's overlooked. The simplicity makes people overlook making sure that you really understand the differences, and that's what gets, people tripped up in trying to figure out which type of design. So if you know, categorical versus numerical, and nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio, that's the fundamental that you really need. Also, scale versus index. A scale is something that perhaps has trying to evaluate a specific construct, and you might add them up, or maybe it's a knowledge scale and they all kind of get at the same thing, versus an index. An index is more like a checklist. The most common one is, I think, the stress life scale. So you have different events, divorce, death of a loved one, transition in life. So those items don't necessarily have to do with each other or influence each other, but having, these different life events might lead to more stress, for example, and that's more of an index. It's a checklist versus a scale. So make sure you know the difference between those two. And then also go over Chapter 7 and review different types of reliability and validity. I'll go over that a little bit more in this overview. I know they were in the slides posted, but we didn't talk about it so much in class, so I'll go over that a little bit more. We did go over qualitative methods and the last two concepts as well. So thinking about recruitment and strategies, and also strategies that address attrition and could help improve retention. So again, when we're talking about sampling, the first large category is probability sampling, and that's when everyone has an equal chance of being selected. So there's simple random sampling, fishbowl, kind of out of a hat, systematic, which is every nth, so you're going to select every third person, for example, and then cluster. So this is where you're actually randomizing or sampling, based on clusters. So you're sampling not the individual, but groups. So it could be a clinic, a church, a school. So keep that in mind when we talk about sampling. And then there's also stratified proportional or non-proportional stratified sampling. Proportional, remember, it has to do with being proportional to the population itself. So the subgroups that you create, are similar to the actual population, versus non-proportional. And sometimes you do this, for example, with Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander statistics. There are few, but we know that there are a lot of health disparities. So lately with the National Health Interview Survey, NHIS, they've been oversampling NHPI so they can better understand health disparities. So it's not proportional to the percentage in the population, but they are oversampling, which is not proportional. And that's illustrated here. So for example, proportional if you had 100 students, you're going to take the same proportion. So 40% freshman, 30 sophomore, 20 junior, 10 senior, and it pretty much looks like the actual population. Non-proportional would be, well, even though it's kind of uneven, we do want equal representation from all of the different stratum. So we're just going to do 25 for each, even though seniors are only, 10% and juniors are only 20%. There's more freshmen and sophomores, but everyone is going to be represented in our study. We're going to sample them all at 25%. So it's not proportional to the population. And where sometimes students get mixed up is when you have an example like this, you might think, oh, it's all proportional, which is the 25, 25, 25, 25. They're all similar to each other. But that actually, if that is not correct. I was going to throw in another example, but I don't want to throw you off. So just remember that the sample that you get, whether or not it's proportional to the actual population, is how you decide whether it's proportional or non-proportional stratified sampling. And then you have your non-probability sampling measure. So here, it's not that everyone has an equal chance. There's either not an opportunity to give an equal chance, or oftentimes in studies, you might just have not enough money or not enough time. But convenience sampling is probably one of the most common. You're doing a survey and you're like, whoever I can stop and have them take my survey, I'm going to have them do that. That's convenience sampling. You might post flyers and get volunteers. And again, motivation is kind of people self-select into things. So again, not everyone has an equal chance of being a part of the study. It could be homogeneous, some type of unique trait. Snowball sampling. So once you identify someone, you ask them who else would be interested, and then you get a new contact, and then you talk to that person, and then you get a new contact. So it kind of snowballs. And then there's quota. So it includes those chosen in a similar proportion to the population traits that you are thinking about. And so that one is quota. But again, non-probability sampling is not everyone has an equal chance of being in your study. Okay, so for types of reliability, I don't think we went over these next two slides so much in class, so let's kind of talk them through a little bit. Let's think about that we're developing a scale on stress. Well, there is a scale on stress, but that's just a really easy example. So when you think about internal consistency, that is that the different items within this scale are measuring the same research domain or construct, which now we've said is stress. So if I was looking at a stress scale and I saw that it said, in the last month, have you been nervous? In the last month, have you been upset? In the last month, have you been frustrated? And those all kind of correlate with each other. I would say that this scale has good internal consistency, and that these items are measuring the larger domain or larger construct of stress. If I saw a fourth question that said, how often do you eat fast food? I would say, ooh, that item doesn't seem to belong in this scale of stress. So internal consistency has to do with the items on the instrument, like a scale or survey, that they're measuring the same thing. Test, retest. So this is the same instrument used to measure the same group of people under similar circumstances. So if I test a group of 20 people, and sometime down the road, and let's kind of assume nothing really happened, there was no intervention, so that relates to same conditions and things like that, that they should probably test the same. So if I give them a stress scale at 0.1 and another stress scale at 0.2, assuming similar conditions, a good indicator that it has good reliability is that it tests the same. So that's test, retest reliability. Now let's kind of change it up a little bit, and let's say we are actually doing observations of stress now, and the researcher and a participant are on each side of a two-sided mirror, or whatever it's called, where you can see the participant and they can't see you. And your job now is to look at someone and say whether they are stressed or not. Now, intra-rater reliability is one person. So if I look at 10 people and I say, that person looks stressed, not stressed, stressed, not stressed, measuring those people again and seeing, how consistent I was, that would be whether I'm consistent with myself. So again, one person, and that's intra-rater reliability. Now let's say we had 2 people. So I rated 10 people and my research partner rated 10 people. Now how both of us were consistent and how much we got right together, that is inter-rater reliability. So if I scored 10 people happy or non-happy just the same as the second person, that would be 100%. So you're kind of looking for that consistency. So it's another type of reliability. Is the scale or instrument reliable if you do it again, you yourself, so intra-rater, or if it's between 2 people observing or doing the same thing. For example, if I'm looking to see if someone's stressed and that's my observation, and a second person has the same observation for the same people, that becomes 2 people, so inter-rater reliability. Parallel forms is actually just a good example of what I mentioned. So you might have a written scale of stress, or you might have observation of stress. So someone just looking at someone and saying, are they stressed or not? So they're different forms of the same or kind of similar measure. They should produce similar results. Maybe that might not be the best example, but it kind of gets at the essence. I'm trying to understand stress, and there are 2 ways of assessing it. I could use a scale, which there are plenty of, or we could use observation. And if those 2 different types of instruments, a scale versus observation, those 2 different methods produce similar results, then we know it has good parallel form reliability. Then you have different types of validity. So let's kind of stick with the same stress scale. And as I mentioned, there's questions around frustration, feeling upset, feeling nervous. So this first type of validity is face validity. So it's almost like the colloquial saying, like, at face value, does this look right? So if someone asked me, does this look like a pretty good stress scale? And I saw those 3 items, I'd say, you know what? At face value, that looks like it does relate to stress. So that's face validity. It appears to measure what it's supposed to measure. Now content, now again, I see this stress scale includes frustration, nervousness, feeling upset. Now content is items are, kind of represent the content or behavior. And a lot of times it could be put together by an expert panel or other people who have expertise. And that's when you kind of say, well, based on the content, it looks like that this scale is pretty valid. Now the next 2 are a little bit more tricky. Criterion-related validity. This is when the scores are correlated with another type of measure of behavior or performance. Predictive validity has to do with the future event. So if we know typically that stress, if someone is stressed, they may not perform as well on an exam. Not to make you nervous for the final exam, but this is always a good example. So if someone is stressed, they might not perform well. And if we find that to be true, then we know that this particular scale has good predictive validity. We know that high stress is going to affect exam scores. Concurrent validity has more to do with using in this example, if we're looking at a stress scale, a new stress scale versus an established stress scale. So if we're looking, very similar to parallel forms, but if we're looking at two different instruments, one's new, one's established, we want to see if, we're kind of looking to see if the new one is valid. We're going to do both and see if how it measures up to the established scale. You know, again, if they're similar, then we can kind of say that this new scale we developed on stress is valid. And that has to do with concurrent validity. Now, construct is the degree to which a measure correlates with other measures it's expected to correlate with or not correlate with. So convergent validity is that it should correlate. So if we have a stress scale, we're going to say, hey, let's look at stress and let's correlate that with depression. We know that those two are related. So if we're testing out this scale and they are related in the way that we expect, then we say, okay, so that stress does correlate with depression. This has good construct validity. We also want to test the opposite. We know that stress should not, or theoretically, should not correlate with, let's say, how many times you eat fast food a week. I don't know. Some might be able to say, yes, that is correlated. But let's say very loosely, we understand that they are not correlated. We would look at those two to make sure they're not correlated. Maybe a better example is, you know, whether or not you like Disneyland. You know, like, well, stress and Disneyland or some type of other preference, they should not correlate together. And let's double check that. And what you're kind of looking for, again, is that with construct validity is that you're looking at other measures that it should correlate with, convergent validity, and then you're also testing it against other measures that it should not correlate with, which is discriminant validity. Okay, so the last part here, you know, make sure you're studying these concepts, RCT, basic steps, CBPR principles, types of evaluation, domains of research, but in particular, statistical techniques, basically which type of test do you use based on your data. As far as basic steps for an RCT, we did go over this a little bit, so you can read through, but I will point out that the most important part to remember is the difference between, or the steps between 4 and 5. Not between, but those particular steps. You always want to make sure you do baseline assessment first before you randomize. Oftentimes, people will say, I'm going to have a bunch of participants, going to recruit them, and then we're going to randomize them into the intervention or control, and then we're going to do baseline, and that's actually incorrect. You don't want people to know, or even the researchers, and especially the statisticians, anybody to know who's in what condition, so you really get a true measure of baseline without any prior knowledge of where they're going. So first you recruit, you enroll, and you have your study sample, and then everybody gets baseline measurement or baseline assessment. So you're looking at your dependent and mediating variables, and this happens before you randomize them. So you do your baseline, and then you randomize into intervention or control. So I would say that's one particular step that often gets flipped that you want to make sure you truly understand that baseline happens first and then randomization happens. Okay, so getting a little bit more into deciding which test to use. You know that if you have two nominal or ordinal variables, and the classic example is a 2 by 2, you're going to use chi-square, and it has everything to do with counts. If you have male, female, and you're looking at, let's say, whether they like pizza, just random example. So you have male, female, likes pizza, yes or no. You can put everybody in a certain category. One, they're either male or female, and they either like pizza or don't like pizza. It's a classic 2 by 2, and in that case you would do a chi-square. Now let's say we are looking at male, female again, and we want to look at a knowledge score. Well, this is where you have numerical data, but with two categories. So again, if you're doing male, female, and you're going to do average test score, you know you're going to do a t-test. Now, what I just described is our independent groups. So one is a group of males, one's a group of females, and we're looking at a numerical value or like a test score. If instead that categorical variable was more related to time, so let's say we're doing a knowledge score, getting an average, and we're actually doing a pre-test, post-test of the same people, that would be a dependent t-test. And again, the way you remember that is just by looking at the categories. Is it time and we're looking at the same people, which is one group twice, which would be dependent t-test, or are they just two different groups of people, which would be independent, meaning they're independent of each other. If you have more than one group, let's say we're still going to do this knowledge, understand this knowledge score, but now we want to divide it up by ethnicity. So we have more than two categories, and that's going to be ANOVA. Now let's say we want to do a correlation. They're both variables are numerical. Let's go back to that stress score. Let's say we have a stress score and it's 1 to 100. We also have a score of happiness, and that's 1 to 100. The appropriate way to analyze that, each one is numerical, would be a correlation. So does stress correlate with happiness? It indicates the strength and type of relationship, positive, negative. But of course, always remember that a correlation, an association, does not speak to cause and effect. And then we also have multivariate. So if you're looking at 3 or more variables, so the prior slide was bivariate, you're looking at variable 1 versus variable 2. But if you're looking at more than 3 or more, you're going to use multivariate analysis, largely some type of multiple regression. The main thing here to remember is if you have a dependent variable that is dichotomous, so here if your y is dichotomous, it's going to be a logistic regression. And then lastly here you see how it's written out. You have your dependent variable, your intercept, which is A, your slope, which is B, and then your actual independent variables, which are X. So those are the things that you are looking into. And this is one way that you could write it. So for example, if you wanted to understand how the relationship between eating, exercise, and sleep, and what the effect of those things are on BMI, then this is how you would write it. So your dependent variable is BMI, and your independent variables are eating, exercise, and sleep. And you would write it in that way. So that's just a little bit of multiple regression. And again, remember, it could be either general linear, it could be, some type of regression, but if the Y is dichotomous, it's going to be, the specific type is a logistic regression. And the main way that I would study to help decide, and even while you're taking the exam, is literally to write things down. That way you can visually see, okay, this is categorical, and then it is by group A, group B, or male, female, or yes, no. And then that way you can visually see, okay, these are all counts. People fit in simple 2x2, so therefore it's a chi-square test. So I would write things down so that it can help you decide better. So here's one example. This program aims to reduce smoking. The population is 148 employees. You have an intervention, which is 2 different types of smoking cessation programs. And the dependent variable is whether or not they stopped smoking or quit smoking after 6 months. Now, the evaluation design is written a little bit differently because it has A and B in there, but really that's just indicating the different types of programs, so type A, type B. But if you were to look at this without those, you could see that it is an experimental design because it has the R's, is random assignment, and it's post-test only. So they did an intervention and then they measured. The type of data is whether they quit or not. So nominal, yes, no, quit, did not quit. And we know that there's 2 different groups. There's group A and there's group B. So again, a classic 2x2. So we know we're going to do a chi-square. And as I just explained as well, when you're, never mind. Classic 2x2, chi-square, kind of writing it out will help you see that. Here's another example. So this program goal was to increase knowledge of HIV, 3,200 incoming freshmen. They did an intervention, which was a 2-hour lecture. And their variable of interest was knowledge. So they wanted to know a knowledge of HIV/AIDS as a 100-point scale. And here you can see the evaluation design is pre-test, post-test. There's no other comparison group, so it's non-experimental, pre-test, post-test. And again, what they're collecting is scores, knowledge score, where 100 points are possible. So now you have time as your category, which is pre-test and post-test, or time 1, time 2, and you're looking at mean scores. So now you're looking at category by something that's numerical. And as I explained earlier, because they are the same group of students, it's actually going to be a dependent t-test. The way that it would be independent, let's say we had 2 different classrooms, and one received the intervention and one didn't, or maybe similar to the other example, they received 2 different types of interventions. We would still do a t-test, except for instead of pre-test, post-test, it would be, group A versus group B, and then looking at their mean scores. So if they're 2 different sets of people, that would be an independent t-test. But again, in this example, it's the same group of students tested before their intervention and after their intervention. So that's what makes it a dependent t-test. So overall, just make sure you really understand the basics of those large categories of which test to use based on the type of data that you have. So what I would do is when I'm reading the scenarios for the final exam, there will be hints in there that says you're looking at the average score. I'm like, okay, that's numerical. I'd write that down. You're looking at whether or not Someone received something. I had to write that down. Okay, so received something, yes or no. Okay, I know that's nominal. So kind of keep that in mind as you're looking at the scenario and reading and understanding what type of data is being presented. I could also present the same type of construct and then ask you to change how the data is viewed. So I might say, first we're looking at a stress score and it's, you know, on a scale of 1 to 100. So now you know that you're probably looking at some type of average. And if it's between two groups, you're going to do some type of a t-test. But if instead I say, well, you know, maybe we're not so much interested in the average, I actually just kind of want to know, are they stressed or are they not stressed? So now I've changed it from completely numerical to I just categorized it. Maybe recoded the data to be yes stress, no stress. And I still have either group A, group B. So now I've gone back to a 2x2 and that's chi-square. So you can have the same scale or the same construct, but you really have to pay attention to how is the data being collected? And then there might be times where I might say, well, let's instead recode and let's look at this from a point of view where it's yes stressed, no stressed versus an average score of stress. So whenever you see those type of things, just try to think, is this nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio? Is it categorical? Is it numerical? And that will help you decide which test to use.
Okay, so we have your proposal portfolio, and of course you have a portfolio guide folder, which is where you can find a lot of information, but just wanted to reiterate that, you know, as soon as you can get your portfolio in, the better, but I did extend it to be due Saturday night, this Saturday, October 19th. And the portfolio really has 3 parts. Again, there's another guide that has even more detail, but section 1 is your written proposal. And if you look at the PH 507 course syllabus, it has the different main components of your paper. I've had a lot of questions about the last part, budget and resource management. I think it says half page, but don't worry if it's not a half page. It's a new section. So for budget, you just want to think about, is there any cost to the work that you're doing? If you're doing a literature review, it's essentially no cost. If you're doing surveys, you might want to have a little bit of a budget and say, you know, you'll probably spend, you know, $10 to $20 on copy and printing. Maybe you're doing some type of a raffle as an incentive or giving away, you know, $5 gift cards. You don't have to, but just try to think about, are there any expenses to your project? And it can be very simple. Again, this is kind of a new section in the proposal paper. So it can be as short as there's no cost because I'm doing a lit review, or here are a few things that I may need to think about as far as budget. The second part, resource management. Go ahead and include your timeline in that section. It's really more about time management. So what are the resources that you need? When do you, you know, propose? When do you defend? And when do you submit to the library? So it says resource, you know, management. It's a little bit, you know, closer to time management. So again, those two, that one section that says budget and resource management is a little bit new. So just do your best on those sections. I do have examples from previous classes. They don't have those sections, but you can certainly see from the other 2 examples how a proposal paper is written. So be sure to check out those examples also in the week 8 folder. Now section 2 is a narrative reflection. It's very personal to you and your journey through this program. So I don't have an example there. It's very subjective, again, to you. So here we're just looking for how you're connecting you know, your courses and experiences, and then you want to include at least 2 artifacts. So it can be a paper, maybe your Guar paper, It can be a group project. Even if it's a video, the one page could say, artifact number 1 is a video, maybe a short description and a link. Or it could be another paper or PowerPoint project or any other final products from any of your core classes. So for section 2, again, you have a narrative, and then you have 2 artifacts that kind of represent the reflection that you talk about in the work that you've done in your core classes. Section 3, again, is the competency form. So you're going to identify foundational and concentration competencies and really think, how does that tie into your thesis or capstone? I also have an example portfolio template. So again, you're the first cohort doing the portfolios. So I have a template and kind of placeholders for where to, have your reflection, basically the order. So your paper, reflection, artifacts, and competency form. Also on the first page, you'll see you have the approval signature form, which you should include if you've done an official proposal. So that would kind of complete everything that you need to advance to candidacy, which kind of leads me to the next checklist. So again, just to recap, to finish off this course, page 507, you want to complete your proposal defense. Many of you are proposing this Thursday. And again, it can be for class only as a practice, or if you have your chair and your committee members, then you can count it as an official proposal defense. I should say more proposal presentation. Defense is for later, but your proposal presentation can be for class only, or it could be your official one where then you would get the approval form signatures. So that's for class. Either way, you have to do a proposal presentation. Then with that, you're going to turn in your proposal portfolio with the 3 sections by Saturday night, and hopefully that'll give you enough time to kind of put the portfolio aside and for that to be done, and then take the final exam. So I listed last week and already had posted the final exam topics, so hopefully you've been able to do some reading and reviewing, but definitely take another look at the final exam guide and topics, and what I mentioned in this presentation as part of your study approach. Once you're kind of beyond this class, but once you have successfully completed your proposal presentation and your committee, approves, you want to make sure that you have the approval form signed. Once you have your portfolio and the official approval, you're going to have that actually as your first page, and you'll see that in the template. And then you want to email that to our admin coordinator, Jessica Wilson, and also copy me on there. And then once your portfolio is into the department, not just to the class, once it's into the department, now you are able to apply for advancement to candidacy. So now, instead of being an MPH student, you will be an MPH candidate. So all of these forms are in MPH Central, and I've also included them in our folder for week 8. So that's it for this presentation. Of course, as always, let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk with you soon and see you in another course.